Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Final Fantasy XVI. I played it on the PS5 because, PS5 exclusive. So let's get into the story. You play as Clive Rossfield. He is the firstborn of the Duke of Rosaria, and, well, he's kind of a shame in the family because he was supposed to get the powers of the Phoenix. Unfortunately, he didn't, and when shit goes sideways, he really could use it, but it turns out he has the power of Ifrit, and no control over it. Unfortunately for him, things go even more sideways for him when literally everyone goes to war. And that's the world he finds himself in. Every nation is at war, the world itself is dying due to the Blight. And of course, being the main character of a Final Fantasy game, you get embroiled in a struggle that is much, much bigger than yourself. Overall, I gotta say, Final Fantasy has hit some darker tones in the story, but man, this game really hits some dark tones covering, politics, slavery, just all sorts of other stuff. Some of the stuff definitely felt like it was inspired by something like Game of Thrones at times, but then there are other times where it did not go Game of Thrones enough. And overall, I enjoyed the story. Even the ending wasn't exactly the way I would have loved it to go, but I do think it was a very fitting ending. Now let's get into the audio, and the first thing I'm going to say is Sid, Ralph Ineson, again, killing it. But honestly, all the voiceover actors did a really good job. Whether it's the main characters, the secondary characters, I think they all brought it and just brought their characters to life wonderfully. As for the sound effects, honestly, the sound effects really blew me away in this game. There are some awesome, smaller, subtle ones that just add to everything. The fact that they put the thought in for those. For example, there's an area where there's these giant ice crystals, and you can literally hear them, cracking, and it sounds like actual ice cracking, just larger in the situation. It's beautifully done. Or when Clive sets down his sword on stone and picks it up, it really sounds like metal being picked up off of stone. Just subtle details, but it's complemented by everything else. The sound effects throughout the world, during combat, during your special moves, enemies, all of it. It's just top tier. It's wonderful. As for the soundtrack, I think it's a great soundtrack, although I will say there wasn't a single song that really stood out to me as iconic like other Final Fantasy games have had, but I really enjoyed the music. Let's get into the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, and this is a much more action-oriented Final Fantasy than we have had. I mean, it's very clear that they've been moving that direction. Lightning Returns was very much more that way, and then you had 15, which was obviously very much more action-oriented. Like any good Final Fantasy, you kill enemies, or in this case, you actually complete missions, actual proper missions, and you get XP, which that is becoming more and more common in, I guess, Final Fantasy, you would say. But the combat was actually really cool in this game, and they have a bunch of ways to make it easy mode, or you can make it more difficult. It's one of those things that's kind of cool. If you want to experience the story more, you are capable of equipping certain items that will allow you to experience the story, but if you really want the more challenging gameplay, you can set it up that way as well. You have your basic attacks, your dodging, etc., but you do get multiple skill sets, we'll call it, and each of them come with their own special abilities. There are certain skills that are specifically attached to that set and permanently attached to that set, so if you have that set equipped, you have that ability. You can have 3 of those sets equipped at any time, but then each of those sets have their own abilities, which you can level those up with ability points, and if you master that ability, you can take that ability and attach it to a different skill set. And so eventually what I started to do was, this is just my way, I took the ultimate ability from each of those skill sets and attached them, so I would have one skill set, but then I would have its ultimate ability and the ultimate ability from another skill set. So when I would trigger it, I could trigger either of those ultimate abilities, and I did that in a couple of slots. So I wound up having 5 ultimate abilities on my guy, which does admittedly have its own disadvantages because some of the regular abilities will charge faster, whereas the ultimate abilities take much longer. That's actually something I really loved, is your ability to customize it. That was just how I felt like doing it, but if you wanted to go a different route, you very easily could, and I think that's fun. As for the world, it's like a pseudo-open world. Not all of the areas are as open. Some of them can be very linear. At at the core, you have your main missions and your side missions, and then even other side objectives like a lot of RPGs are doing nowadays. And if you wanted to, you could really easily just follow the main story. I admittedly sunk a lot of time into side missions and hunts and stuff, and then completed the story. It's probably why it took so long to get to this review. I saw a lot of stuff about how this is a very linear game, and in some ways it very much is, but it's not like the first time we've seen this in a Final Fantasy. The one thing it is sorely lacking is Tonberries. Come on, guys. I joke, but there are some things that I did feel were lacking and weren't as well done as they could have been. One element is, in Final Fantasies, or most RPGs, there's the whole elemental rock, paper, scissor system. It's more or less lacking in this game. While certain elements will do more damage, using fire on a fire enemy isn't really going to matter versus using ice on an ice enemy. If you use fire on an ice enemy, you'll get a bit of a bonus, but ice attacks aren't going to suddenly heal them. They're not going to do the normal thing that we're used to seeing in RPGs. I will say, it honestly didn't really bother me that much. It's just something that I noticed. One thing I do want to point out, because I love it in games that do it, pausable and skippable cutscenes. I think that's always phenomenal. A couple of things I do kind of have to complain about is, like, sprinting in the game. I don't love. You have to be running for like 100 yards in certain areas to start sprinting. Once you do, it's nice. And I do think the game does a cool thing in that it slows you down and puts you at a run so that your characters can have a conversation, so that if you're on your way to a place, you don't burn through all this conversation. You actually still get to experience it, which is something I do find frustrating in games when you miss out on conversation because you're sprinting. But I would like it to be like button click so that I can just start sprinting rather than having to, build up to it. It gets a little annoying doing that. Also, one weird thing is, like, some doors only require one button click, whereas others require you to click a button and then hold down the R2 button. I don't know why they did that, why it's not like all doors are one way or all doors are the other way. It's just weird decision making in my opinion. Oh, but I will say, I guess if there is one big issue, and I think this is an issue in a lot of more action oriented games, the camera. There are definitely times where the camera just doesn't do what you need it to. It positions itself in really shitty ways. And yeah, you can adjust it, but when you're in the heat of combat, I don't want to be screwing with my camera. It did lead to dodging being difficult at times, so And then last but not least, it has a New Game Plus, which I love. I always love New Game Plus. Now let's get on to the controls, and the first thing I'm going to say is, I think the controls work very well. I think they are well set up, and they are very responsive, so I don't have anything to say about them really beyond that. They work very well. Then last but not least, the graphics and visuals. And one thing that this Final Fantasy does is it kind of returns to ye olde roots in that it's much more medieval feeling. And they bring it to life very well. These smaller towns and villages feel like a good medieval village, or at least what you would imagine they would look like and feel like. As well as like the clothing, I think they do a good job with that. But in general, I think the outfits for all the characters are really, really cool. All the characters like really physically fit with who they're supposed to be, with their archetypes, and I like that they were able to bring that to life so very well. But then, of course, you have the icons, which that has been a big thing in the marketing, and for the most part, I think they are pretty awesome. Ifrit is by far the coolest in my opinion. Bahamut was not exactly my favorite, but I think the others were brought to life very well. And then just the special effects in general. For your different attacks, how all of those look, what the enemies are doing in their attacks, the crazy magic attacks, everything I just think is brought to life so very well, and it flows extremely well. But going beyond that, you have all the subtle details, whether it's the facial hair or the texturing in the clothing, or just the texturing in the world, bringing these different biomes to life and creatures to life. Small details really matter, and they did a good job with them. From a visual standpoint, I really just don't have any complaints with this game. I think it was well directed, well acted, all of that was brought to life just phenomenally. My last two things, I was really blown away by the fact that I didn't have any crashes. I generally can't get through a game anymore without it crashing at least once. This did not crash the entire time. And we're talking literally, 70 plus hours, 80 hours, somewhere in there of gameplay, and this never crashed on me. Although, to go against that, I did have a few spots of lag, but nothing destructive to the experience, so that's a huge plus. So to wrap this up, I think it's a good game. I really do. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's my favorite Final Fantasy of all time, but I think they brought, a new Final Fantasy to us, and it's excellent and a lot of fun to play. So yeah, if you have a PS5, I have no problems recommending this. When it's ported, if it's ported to other consoles, I would fully recommend picking up this game. I had so much fun with it. Okay, so in the comments down below, why don't you tell me, what is your favorite Final Fantasy weapon? And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one. But all the voiceover works are on...